Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Hello, my name is Kira, and I will be your host for today's members class, The Effects of Disrupted Attachment and Early Trauma on the Developing Mind with Bessel van der Kolk. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation, also known as West Kelowna, BC, Canada. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Bessel van der Kolk, a pioneer in trauma research. Bessel founded a leading center in 1984 dedicated to studying and treating traumatic stress. And it's with my pleasure to hand it over to you, Bessel.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Let me share my screen. So I thought, since this is the embodiment body lab, I'll talk about embodied self-awareness. And it's taken me a long time to wrap my head about it. And just very recently, I'm learning some new stuff that I'd like to share with you guys. And so when we talk about trauma, we tend to talk about something that happened out there to us. Is it verbal? Is it nonverbal? All this sort of stuff. But it's important to realize, it's very fundamental to treating trauma, is that the event is over. And being able to talk about the event may be helpful, may clarify things for you, but being able to talk about what happened to you doesn't change the way that your brain has been changed by trauma. The issue with trauma is not an event, and if you just can talk about it, everything's going to be okay. It is trauma changes you, and it changes the brain, and it changes the way you perceive the world. And I recently came across this line from Marcel Proust, and I think it's just right. It is our perceptions that we need to change. We cannot really change the world about us, although maybe that we want to do that also. But therapy really consists of changing how you experience yourself and the world about you. And so my exploration of this sort of started, although I got into this very early on, when a bunch of yoga teachers, these guys, came to my lab about 15 years ago and said, we are a bunch of yoga teachers. We have done, we have worked with combat veterans, we have worked with rape victims, and we are really impressed with how well it works. Would you like to team up with us to research what yoga does to people? And I said, I'd love to, but I don't have any money. And they said, that's good. We don't have any money either. Research costs a lot of effort, a lot of money. And as always happens when you do something new, we all volunteered our time. And it takes an enormous amount of dedication and commitment and loss of money in your own pocketbook to get this done. So we started this study. And so what we did in the trauma center, we did an 8-week yoga course and compared with an 8-week dialectical behavior course. Dialectical behavior is about being mindful about yourself, observing yourself. It's Marshall enhanced method that is very popular out there. And so after 8 weeks of treatment, the people on DBT had not changed. And the people in yoga had a significant change in their physiology, in the way they experienced themselves. And so we get into yoga, and I get into yoga myself also. And I say, the issue with yoga is really it changes your relationship to your body. And so we couldn't find a good body scale. So the next thing we do is we develop a body scale. And a team gets together, and I say, well, when I take my yoga class, my chest cleaves the air more cleanly. And people go, eh. I say, well, when I walk in my yoga class, I come out, my feet touch the ground more purposefully. And people say, eh. So it takes a long time to create a scale where you can sort of measure what happens to you and to your body, your relationship to your body after your trauma. And what was very striking is that after 8 weeks of dialectical behavior therapy, people felt terrible about their bodies before, they felt terrible about bodies afterwards. But after 8 weeks of yoga, people started to like their bodies. And that was sort of interesting. And then we studied heart rate variability, and we saw that yoga changes heart rate variability, and then we saw that it decreases PTSD symptoms and all kind of other mental symptoms. And the way we went the study is that when you do a study, you have to compare something with something else. So you can measure it's not only because you're nice to people that it got better. And I made the terrible mistake of assigning our control group, which was a health education group. It's about as boring as it gets, to the funniest clinician in the clinic. And she was a very active, loving, funny person. And people in that group really got very close very quickly, and they put their arms around each other and they brought in food. And so I said to Ilya at some point, that's unfair. And you're the control group, and you shouldn't be laughing with people having good all the time. Just be boring with your yoga class. And if I ever hear people laugh and giggle again, I'm afraid I have to fire you. Well, of course, Ilya tried not to be funny and not to be supportive, but she failed. So the group continued to have a very good time. And then you do the research, and research always confronts you with interesting and unexpected things. And so here's the group where people are having fun and bringing in food. Uh, People felt much better being connected with people for a while, but after a while, they went back to how they felt before. So the talking and the camaraderie did not really change people's relationship to themselves. And the much more stolid yoga teachers who were very serious, people never laughed, every week people got a little bit better. They gradually got better by just paying attention to their body. And I started to present these data to my colleagues, and I say, boy, we found that yoga really works probably better than any medication we have studied for PTSD. And people said, Bessel's really gone off the deep end now. He now puts people's butt in the air and twists their spine in a pretzel, and that's supposed to help PTSD. Yes, it does. And that was really intriguing. And so I was the person who did the qualitative interviews. I interviewed everybody after the yoga classes. And my favorite thing that somebody said, before I did yoga, I went to the supermarket and would just dump stuff in my cart. And now when I walk to the supermarket, I check in with my body, what my body needs, and I carefully select what my body needs. So very interesting, different perception of themselves and their relationship to food. Uh, and then I submitted this paper to the American Journal of Psychiatry, where I had published like 20 papers in the past. And in that, I had to give a clinical explanation of what your research does. And so one of my patients, my own patient, my psychotherapy patient, was part of the study. And she would write me emails after her yoga sessions. And I asked her, can I please use your emails as an example of what yoga does? And so what did we find is, hold on for a second. I have to read this. Um, so, sorry. So basically, you can read it yourself. I don't have to read it for you. But she said, I finally feel comfortable in my body. I used to cut myself and hurt myself, but now I have a relationship with my body, and I notice that I hold the trauma in some parts of my body, but by allowing myself to feel my sensations and to explore my relationship to my body, I became calmer and I became aware of myself. And as she says, life is more manageable. I'm more attuned to my body and present in the moment. I'm more tolerant of physical touch. My husband are curled up together in bed watching movies for the first time. I think that's about as good as any of us can hope for. But the American Journal of Psychiatry says your clinical example detracts from the scientific validity of your findings. So I could not get it published in a major psychiatric journal. Why not? Because it doesn't fit with the framework that it has to do with the body. And so then we do brain scans before and after. And what do we discover is that after a short time of doing yoga, there's some changes in parts of the brain having to do with self-experience, experiencing your body, and being able to read what goes inside of you. Uh, So, so why was this study so important? Uh, And for me, it was a very big thing because it really sort of made it more valid to me that the body keeps the score. And if you uh, get more in touch with your body and feel your body more clearly, you get better. Uh, and it's interesting that out there, we just looked at the education rates in America about trauma, and we discovered that 20% of all psychology programs have an elective about trauma, and 80% have nothing. So our psychology programs are totally focused on teaching people CBT. I love CBT myself. I do it on my wife all the time. I point out the error of her thinking, and that should look at things in a more rational and reality-based treatment. And my wife is always so grateful when I do that to her. And I really can't believe that psychology has sunk as low as to think that you can reason with people, particularly in the political climate we live in. Reason? Getting people to sense it? Of course it doesn't. Huh? And so, how do you get there? And so, uh, and our psychology, it happens all the time. It supervises lots of people. And these young psychologists say, uh, so, Dr. Van der Kolk, how can I help to manage this patient? And I say, you think you can manage other people? I can barely manage myself, for God's sake. Like, I can't manage other people. But still, our culture is very much like, I'm going to change you. I'm going to change your normal. It doesn't work. And I think you guys who are in the embodiment lab would be on the same wavelength as I am in that regard. And so, but very early on in my awareness of trauma, uh, I become aware that trauma is expressed in the body. And I suddenly start thinking about the last page of my anatomy textbook in medical school. And there it is. And I think to myself, yeah, Frank Netter, he really got it. When people become really upset, they activate their bodies and go into fight and flight. That's the normal response to terrible situations. And what our research has shown is that when people go into a trauma state, their frontal lobe shuts down. Their speech center sort of disappears. How do we know that? You know it from yourself. When you get really angry and really upset and really scared, we all become a bunch of blubbering idiots. Don't argue with somebody who is really enraged because there is no frontal lobe there. They just express their anger. So wait till people are calm before you can have a conversation. You can't do that because there's no frontal lobe. Huh? And so, what our research showed very clearly is that when people go into their trauma state, the frontal lobe shuts down, and the limbic system, the part of your brain that's in charge of the housekeeping of your body, takes over. And so you have automatic animal-like responses to when you get traumatized, which we have for good reason, because when something threatening happens, we're supposed to fight back or to hit people or to run away, to have a bodily response to trauma, not like, oh my God, it's really upsetting, what shall I do? You immediately go, you do something. And so what became clear to me early on in my research is that when you're a traumatized person, this part of your brain oftentimes runs the show, and the frontal lobe doesn't. And so being reasonable with traumatized people is probably not the right thing to do. You need to really calm that body down and calm the limbic system down. And so what I've been saying for a long time is that what therapy is really about limbic system therapy. The part of your brain that's in charge of basic bodily functions. And of course, what's interesting to me is there must be a lot of people teaching in universities who have actually never seen traumatized people. I know about trauma. Well, you know who else knows about trauma? EMTs, policemen, firemen. They come across terrible, terrible scenes of dead people and dying people and horrified people. And when you do that, as I did as a medical student working in the emergency room, when people are traumatized, they are frozen, they're agitated, they can barely talk. And so it's very striking. It's a body issue. Huh? And you either shut down or you blow up, and you're not really, no longer you are yourself. And if you get chronically traumatized, you lock this inside of your body. And your body becomes a body that's always agitated and try to deal with your agitation, or that numbs itself out. And so you really become, I think, was it Hannah, Thomas Hannah, wrote beautifully about it, about how the body starts becoming a terrified body, and the body becomes an angry body. And so you need to work with people's body and people's body sensations. Huh? Uh, but another thing I'd like to say is that there is a curious arrogance in their fields in some ways, that people say, I have found the answer. I have found the treatment of choice. The moment somebody says that, I run away from them. Because when we started to do our work, which is in the 80s, nobody knew anything about the treatment of trauma. It was like I had my lab at Harvard at the time, and my colleagues would say, Bessel, why do you study trauma? That is such a bizarre thing to study. I bet that when you croak, nobody will ever talk about trauma again. And I said, I hope so. I hope so. Before I die, I won't, but so we knew nothing back then. And then slowly we learned something about somatic experiencing, and we learned something about EMDR. And today we're over here, but it's a work in progress. And it's interesting for me that I'm 80 years old. In the past month, I learned a whole new piece of information about trauma I never knew before, and that I'm sure none of you knows about either, because I had to dig hard to find it. So I hope to share some of that with you. About 10 years ago, I had to start to do psychedelic studies. I was 70 years old, and today I know something about psychedelics. 10 years ago, I don't. And so for me, it's always a question, what is next? How is this field evolving? So I'm giving you a little snapshot of what I know, or a little bit of what I know in 2024, and that's going to change over time. Um, I'm not going to show this movie this time, but when you look at traumatized people, the body keeps a score, and people hold their bodies. And what you try to do when you're continuously agitated, you try to not feel. You try to push it away. You try to dull your senses. About half of all people who are traumatized uh, have problems with alcohol. A huge correlation between drug abuse now, like a gigantic contribution with drug abuse. People abuse drugs not because they want to bother people around them, because they want to make themselves feel calm in their bodies. And actually, it's interesting that very early on, I cut my teeth on working with Vietnam veterans. And what did we find back then is that soldiers who had taken heroin in Vietnam had much lower incidence of PTSD. That made perfect sense to me, because heroin calms down your nervous system. And then these guys came back to the US, and most of them kicked their habit, because addiction is very much a state dependent issue. And if the weather is hot and you see people dying in the jungle and the atmosphere in the jungle brings it back. But if you live in North Dakota, there's nothing that we mention about Vietnam. And so the craving in your body isn't there anymore. And these are interesting issues. So people cannot stand the feelings in their body. And so they try to push it away. Uh, um, uh, in our world, people do a lot of positive psychology. They say, think, be grateful, and just be happy and concentrate on the positive. Well, you can do that, but your body will not be persuaded, and your body will continue to behave as if you're in your trauma, and the trauma gets expressed as physical illnesses, as angry and out of control behaviors, and all kinds of behaviors to try to manage yourself. And so it's wagging your finger. People don't do that. No, find out when people do these things, what does it do for them? How does it help them? When did it start? What were they trying to cope with? And in order to help people with their anorexia and their self-cutting and their addictions, you need to really see what these methods have done for them to help them to survive and to say, let's see what else can help you. And so our job is not to wag our fingers and tell people to stop it. Our job is to actually instill new capacities in people. And certainly yoga and body work are two of the new possibilities that we have to offer. Now, I'm going to make this very brief. This issue of trauma and traumatic memories has been talked about for a very long time, but it sort of keeps going up and down. But there was a particular guy back in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, who I think really nailed it. His name was Pierre Janet. And Pierre Janet worked at the Salpêtrière, it's an old homeless shelter in Paris. He was part of these early neurologists, and there he is. And he wrote the first book about trauma. And what's the book called? It's called L'automatisme psychologique, psychological automatisms. And what does Janet tell us is that when people are overwhelmed, when something terrible happens that is just too much for people to handle, they cannot integrate it. They cannot process what's going on, and they shut down and they fragment. And so when people are terrified and upset, they keep reacting in a way that doesn't make any sense because it's too much for them to handle. You automatically keep replaying the trauma, not in stories, but with your actions, with your emotions, and with your sensations. So for me, the work of the body is at the core. When people say, oh, I saw my little sister drown in a swimming pool when I was 7 years old. The first thing I will say is, what happens to your body when you tell me that? Not tell me the story about your sister, because that doesn't help him. It's really the body sensations around it is what keeps coming up. And my mirror neuron system also tends to really be activated when you say to me, and I sit with you and I really pay attention to you, that your little sister drowned in a swimming pool. I feel a sense of heartbreak or gut wrench in my own body too. So a very important part of treatment is to really, for the therapist to read and know their sensations and see how they match the sensations of the people they're working with. And then he says a number of things that is really worth repeating, even though it's sort of been it's a long time ago. He says, managing your trauma takes an enormous amount of energy, and it is very hard to pay attention to very many other things because sort of managing the remnants of the trauma takes sort of absorbs a lot of stuff, and most traumatized people don't have a lot of energy left, let's say, to take care of their kids or to do their jobs very well because it takes so much damn work to keep the body under control. And then he goes, and he says, when things are overwhelming, uh, it goes into your body. The memories cannot be assimilated, and they're split off, and they lead a separate existence. Later on, Freud says trauma is like a splinter in the mind. It's like it's sitting there, but it's a separate experience that are not integrated, and they keep coming back in actions and sensations. The way that they treated it back then was with hypnosis. And I'm really astounded that hypnosis has bit the dust in our culture today, because basically the way that people get better is to go into an altered state of consciousness. What we explore, for example, these days in psychedelics, which I hope to have a minute to talk to you about at the end of this talk. Uh, uh, and then Jeanette said one other thing that really struck me. Namely, when I started to work with Vietnam veterans, I was in my late 30s at that point. I had two small children at home. My patients were my age, they had gone to Vietnam. And my kids at home were doing what 2 and 4 year old kids do. They threw temper tantrums and they threw their foot on the floor and they didn't pay attention, all kinds of stuff. But with my own kids, when they were out of control, like, yeah, he's a 2 year old, like 2 year olds out of control. But the veterans behave like 2 year olds. And I got very quickly interested, like, what is going to happen to my kids that will probably make them pretty well regulated adults? And what happened to these guys that their behavior is like 2 year old behaviors? And that really became quite an important part of my work initially, also with Judy Herman, namely that uh, people get stuck in their development. And so when you're traumatized early on in life, you may behave like a 2 year old, and your logic may be like a 2 year old. And for me, I think a very important part of becoming a good therapist is to learn to play with very small children and to be with very small children and to be very interested in the way that children make sense out of the world. Because a lot of our traumatized people make sense out of the world on the level of a 2 or 4 year old kid, and they see things very differently. That our logic doesn't necessarily uh, match their way of thinking, and so they get stuck. And traumatized people get stuck in their biology, in their body sensations, in their mental development. And our job is how do we help to soften the trauma so people can go on with their lives? And life is about life. I keep being amazed. I just was just at Yale last week, and some people presented the cases to me, and all they presented to me was what was wrong with this person. And I said, well, does this person have anything going for himself? Oh, yeah, he's had a job full time, some sort of programmer. Oh, and he also has played in the band for 30 years. They left out the fact that this guy played in the band. That's a big thing. And so, just as we need to inquire about trauma, we need to inquire with what are you good at? What gives you a feeling of pleasure? When do you really feel like you're really yourself? What are the best experiences in yourself? But there's this weird thing of psychology that you go after all the crap and you really don't go after the fullness of people's experience. Um, and so um, that gets us into a second piece, and that is when we started to define PTSD, and that was a minor element in that process actually. Uh, we talked about a terrible event has happened to you outside of the usual human experience. And what comes in very slowly is that for most people, these events occur in the context of their attachment system. And when I was still on the DSM committees, I always tried to introduce the issue of attachment into our assessment and evaluation, but I never got people to be interested in attachment. And as it turns out, as I'll show you hopefully, is that for most people, the issue in their life is not the trauma, but it's the security of the attachment. And so Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, who I like and love a lot, came out with this book called What Happened to You? Not a bad title, but the real question is, who was there for you? Because if something terrible happens to you, which happens to many of us a lot of the time, if we have people who have our back, who are there for us, it makes all the difference in the world. And for example, uh, my late friend Claude Cheptop did a study in New York City after 9/11 and studied who got PTSD after 9/11. And it turned out it was the people who were in domestic violence relationships, the people who were partnered up with people who were traumatized. They got traumatized by 9/11. Why is that? Because they could not feel safe at home. But if something terrible happens to you and somebody says, oh my God, I'll be there for you. I'll go with you to the hospital. I'll help you to get your medicine. I'll give you a bath. I'll wipe your ass if necessary. That makes all the difference in the world, whether it's a tolerable versus an intolerable experience. So the origin of the tape that I'm about to show you is at a program called Shakespeare and Company. Part of the reason why I'm living where I am uh, is we got really interested in the issue of identity. How many people we work with in our workshops say, oh, you ask me, who are you? And they'll say, I'm an incest survivor, or I'm a Vietnam veteran, or I'm a adult child of alcoholics. We keep being astounded by how people's identity was locked in their trauma. It's not like I went to that college or I had that job or I lived. It was the trauma who defined them. And so we got very interested in how can you help people to change their identity. And the clear thing we came up with was theater. And so my wife, Alicia, and I took an advanced Shakespeare acting course, and we learned about theater. And we still very much promote theater because in the theater, you can play a role and embody another person than who you are. And let me give you an example. They have a program called Shakespeare in the Courts in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, where I live. If you're a juvenile delinquent, steal a car, break into somebody's home, you have a 50% chance that the judge here in Pittsfield will give you a choice. You can either go to jail or become a Shakespeare actor. I live in a very civilized part of the world. I'm very proud of living here. And half of the kids choose to go to jail because it's really scary to become a Shakespeare actor. But once they take the Shakespeare course, they learn what it feels like to be a powerful king and to feel like what happens to betray him and what it feels like to be different things. And they're helped to stand up there and say their lines. So, for example, at one point, there's a 16-year-old girl who has robbed houses or something like that, and she get condemned to become Shakespeare. And at one point, the theater director says to her, no, they're playing Hamlet. And she says, you're Ophelia now, and you're going to tell Hamlet how much you love him, and he's going to reject you and say, get thee to a nunnery. And so, and after that, you go to kill yourself because you're heartbroken because he doesn't love you. And then he comes by and he picks you up and carries you off screen. You get it? She says, I get it. And this is not going to happen. I'm an incest survivor and no guy is going to touch me. And the theater director says, actually, you're Ophelia and you're dead. And she said, okay, if I'm Ophelia, I'm dead, he can carry me off the stage. So it's all a question of how you perceive yourself and how you identify yourself. So as part of this whole program, we met a young actress called Louisa Franconi, who has a baby. And 8 months after she has this baby, she sends us this tape around.
Hi. 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 Hello. Hi. Ba. 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 Hi. 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 Hi.
And I can't see you guys, but whenever I show this, I showed it somewhere else yesterday, people start smiling. I've shown it in Cape Town, I've shown it in Beijing, and all around the world, people always feel very enlivened by this little movie. Why is that? That's because this is fundamentally who we are as human beings. This is the goal of life, is to be in sync together.